All right, well, welcome to this class on global economic outlook. Can you hear me well? Great. What I will do is I'll just jump in with 2 or 3 slides, and then I will pause and ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves and tell me a subject or an area or a focus that you would be particularly interested in, and I'll try to weave that in for the next class. So I'm choosing this time of the year to offer this class because we are just at the end of the annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. This year, the meetings were held in Morocco, in Marrakesh, and the plan had been to do this earlier, but it wasn't possible because of the pandemic. So, it was almost, again, moved, but this time it worked out. So they just concluded the meetings. I spent myself 25 years working at the International Monetary Fund, and so you will see my presentation is a little bit tainted by that experience, but I think for good reasons, because the IMF is an organization that has almost universal membership. The World Bank does too. They have very similar governance structures, and you could say, well, so does the United Nations. That is true. But the membership and the organization of the IMF and the World Bank is very different from the United Nations. The United Nations is more or less one country, one vote. And World Bank and IMF are pretty much organized by financial and economic strength. So, for example, in the IMF, the United States have a little bit more than 16% of the votes. So that's obviously a very major member. Japan has a little bit over 6%, and then there are a few other countries, for example, Germany, France, Saudi Arabia, that have what is called their seat representing just their own countries. And then there are groups of countries, smaller countries, that are represented by one member. So when you look at the voting, it's very much representing the economic strength of members. And that, of course, you can imagine, makes for a very different dynamic than if you are at the United Nations, where every country, whether it's the United States or Brunei or a small island economy, speaking up with the same rights and votes. So all of that to tell you that IMF and World Bank are very important institutions in the international mix. But they're not the only ones. What is happening here? Yeah. My second slide, what happened to that one?
That was the second slide. That was originally first, and then they had the...
Oh, maybe it's back here. Okay. There are a number of other institutions, and we had a whole class on the sort of international financial and economic architecture. But I'm not going to go into that. So, simply to say that the sources that I am using here are very much data collected and distributed by the IMF, by the World Bank, by the World Trade Organization, which is also an important player, by the OECD, which is an organization that represents more the larger and wealthier countries, the G20, which is again a group of countries that have approximately 85% of world GDP, so it's a big country group. There are some data that are coming from the BRICS, which is a group of newly industrializing countries, and a few pieces of information that I'm taking from civil society, which is well recognized in meetings such as the annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF. There are also a few more specialized institutions like the Bank for International Settlements, and we get to that later on. But here's the main message during the World Bank IMF annual meetings. The main message, and I put the managing director's picture up there because, that way it's you can be reminded, this is Kristalina Georgina, she is the managing director. And the World Economic Outlook, a small picture, is the flagship publication that is published at the time of the annual meetings. In fact, it's published twice a year, spring meetings as well. But so a lot of what I'm talking about is coming from the World Economic Outlook and other publications. Global growth to slow from 3.5% in 2022 to 3% this year, and then 2.9% next year. So that's kind of the high-level message. One thing to keep in mind is that, a number like 3% for the entire world is, summarizing an enormous amount of information in just one number. And even for an individual country, let's say the US GDP, is still a huge number because you're adding up everything that's happening in the economy, whether it's health sector, pharmaceuticals, the farm sector, anything. And so I'm saying that because it takes a long time to put these data together, and generally there's a delay of at least 3 months, if not 6 to 9 months, that just takes countries physically to produce these data. So if we say global growth from 3.5% in 2022, in many instances, that's still an estimate and rather than a final number. And so for 2023, for the current year, 3% is even more of a forecast estimate, and the 2.9% even more. So in order to justify this kind of information, you really need to bring in a lot of other data and information to make that kind of the case for this sort of very specific forecast. And so one thing you notice when you look at the fine print is the presenters of this information will say, well, lots of things could happen. For example, just as the annual meeting started, the Hamas attack in Israel took place, and everybody knows this will have some effect. We don't know what exactly the effect will be, but it will certainly have an effect. But the general message is things are not going up, right? Things are going kind of a little bit more down. And the other message is that these numbers are very small. So if you subdivide them into advanced economies and developing countries, you'll see that in the advanced economies, the growth rates are, 1-2%, something like that. And that's pretty okay. We've lived with that for a long time, quite well. But in the developing countries, these growth rates translate into 4 and 5%, and some even less. And for many of those countries, that's quite a disaster, because those countries need to grow much faster to lift people out of poverty and to provide for very basic needs. So that's kind of the background to these numbers. The other big message is inflation continues to decelerate from 9.2% in 2022 to about 6% this year, and then further down in 2024. So why does the IMF think so much about inflation? Well, inflation is a major issue in many countries. Not so much in the US, especially it hasn't been in the last 10, 15 years. In fact, many of our children or grandchildren, they have no idea what inflation is because they just really haven't seen it. But everyone in this room, I think, was around in the 70s when inflation was 10, 11, 12%, and it was pretty scary. But in countries like Turkey, inflation is 80, 90% and more. And just imagine running your life with that kind of an inflation rate. So globally, inflation is a very important indicator. And so here the message is positive in the sense that, it is going down. So what the message means is that we are in globally for a kind of a soft landing, which is a lot better than a hard landing. But at the same time, a risk that was much discussed is geo-economic fragmentation. And we'll talk about that more in just a minute. The second slide I want to show you.
No.
I cannot advance it here.
Not right. Now, can you click? I think maybe that's what you need to. I'll go forward now. Now try. There. So we have to click.
Okay. The second message that I want to share with you, and this is something that is a result of analysis. These are not raw data that you could observe. So here, the staff were looking at the following question. If you think about the growth rate path everyone was on prior to the pandemic, and then compare that to what happened during and after the pandemic, what was the relative loss? And you can see if we start on the very right-hand side, you see the very low-income countries, the LIDCs, they experienced a negative growth of more than 6 percentage points. So that's a huge loss for people and countries that can least afford it. And when you think about that kind of, disaster, we haven't seen this sort of negative growth in the US or in the advanced economies for decades. Perhaps the Great Depression is the closest, and we know about that just from history, essentially. So this is a real disaster for many people and many countries. And, what it means is, it has implications internationally, for example, on migration. And people will see, there's no way to go here, we're not growing, we're not developing. So that's why this is a real dangerous situation.
Categories at the end there. What are they?
So the next one is emerging developing countries. That will be the Brazils, Nigeria, etc. Also countries with large populations, fast population growth, and who really need positive growth to develop their countries. China also experienced a major loss, and of course there it was well advertised, this radical closing of factories for many, many weeks and months, so it surprises nobody. Yes?
Does everyone define it the same way?
Yes. You mean the national, the underlying statistics?
Yes.
Yes, I will get to that in 1 second, but they do. EA is Euro area, so all the countries, the 20 countries that use the euro, also experience negative growth, but much less dramatic. And the US is really a surprise, because the US was gaining from the whole process, which is pretty counterintuitive. But I do think that when we think back on how it was managed in this country, yes, things closed down, but the next day, checks were going in the mail, spending was being supported very aggressively by the administration all throughout the pandemic, and people are very resilient. We were talking earlier, how many of us had even heard of Zoom prior to the pandemic? And then there were a few heart palpitations the first time you were sitting in front of a Zoom meeting. And, and the first time you spoke in front of a Zoom meeting, I remember thinking, this is so stressful. And now we think this is, no big deal. And I see a few Zoom persons over there who will introduce themselves, I'm sure with no fear at all. So, we were able to adjust extremely well because everyone has a computer. Think about a poor country. Most people don't have computers, or many people don't have, or don't know how to deal with them, or they don't have the capacity. Because Zoom, you need to have a good camera, a microphone, etc. You have to be sure that you have electricity and things like that. So I think the difference between Europe and US we'll get to a little bit later. because of course in Europe you have many of the similar conditions, but there are a few important differences. And I'm going to stop here and let everyone introduce yourselves, but you had one question.
Did you say what AE group that is?
Advanced economies. Yeah, sorry.
Who's included in that?
So that includes the US, it includes the Euro area, and it includes countries like Australia, Canada, so all of the advanced economies. All right, so let us do a round of introductions. How about if we start with the persons on Zoom? I see one person who's called Zoom user. Go ahead, please introduce yourself.
My name is Karen Footner, and I'm just here to become more educated because the economy seems so rocky right now.
Okay, thank you. And then I see Michael Fisher.
Yes, good evening, all. Yeah, I'm just trying to keep abreast of the rest of the world's activities while we in this country witness all the other bad things that are happening in the world. Mm-hmm. And I'm just very interested in the outcome of our brothers and sisters around the globe.
Okay, and and if you would like to add, any particular topic you're interested in. And Michael, you see in the statistics that this data here that this is partly a feel-good class because the US does pretty well here, as you can see, and I have many other examples of that. Over to you.
Yeah, I'm very, very grateful for that.
Dodi?
Hit your space bar.
I think you're on mute. Okay, we'll go on with who else is there? Mario?
Hi. I'm just trying to stay educated with what's going on in the bigger perspective of the world. We travel a lot, and I like to just stay smart with what's going on. And I like this aspect that you're showing with pandemic-related loss, because I think the impacts of that are bigger than we're able to comprehend. So just trying to learn.
Okay. And let's see, I have William Sweeney on my list.
I don't see him.
No? Okay.
Sikorsky.
But I see Mo Karski.
Is Mario in the nude? That's why he doesn't want his video on?
Yeah, his underpants on.
This is Bill Mokarski. I'm not sure, probably can't see me.
Yes, I can see you. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just an interested listener more than anything else. Just am somewhat surprised, as bad as the U.S. made it seem, that we actually didn't experience a lot of GDP loss during that time. That, the news was making it sound like it was horrible, and it wasn't great, but we didn't experience anything compared to what some of the other countries experienced.
Yes, I think I was surprised myself when I saw this.
Yeah.
But I think it does explain, some of politically what goes on in other countries.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, so I'm just a novice, just listening, that's all.
All right, welcome. And Dodi, you're still on mute. But we know.
Maybe she's on her cell phone. It's kind of hard.
Maybe you're on your cell phone.
I just sent her a message to unmute.
Okay.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I'm unmuted, and I'm just here to learn. I'm follow the news and the economic news just like everybody else. And so I think this is a great opportunity for us to listen to you, Claudia. So thank you.
Welcome to the class. Okay, we'll continue back there, perhaps.
Don Curry, I'm here just to suck up information.
Okay. Leave out the word just in future, please.
I'm Jody Rennie, and I'm pretty much here for the same thing, is to get a better grasp, being a little less self-focused, a little bit more world-focused.
And you also like to travel.
Love to travel.
Oh,
Well, as I watch what's happening in the world, and I see inflation rates of 90, 100%, like in Turkey and Russia, and I'm trying to say, how do these countries survive with that kind of thing? So anything I can find out about that would be helpful.
okay, thank you.
Lois Shepherd. At one point in my life, I was in charge of the international division of the Republican Party. So I did an enormous amount of traveling back in the 80s. And I went to many, many of these countries and stayed engaged and involved, but not economically. I didn't understand them then, and I don't understand them now. And I'm hoping to understand more about how our economy affects everybody else's. My particular question to you, though, is I understand that there has been just recently a conference in South Africa of the major traders in the world. And that one of the big comments and one of the big points of discussion was, are they going to continue to use the US dollars in that trading sphere? What would the repercussions be if they don't?
I think that's a wonderful question. Yes.
I'm Bruce Jones, and I was involved in businesses mostly in Europe, but many countries, and that's still a great interest. I like the comment made by someone just before me that I like very much to consume news and learn about things that are outside of the United States.
Okay.
I'm Bruce Robinson. A very long time ago, I was a professor of Asian studies. My field is South Asia, India. But believe me, the research I did had nothing to do with economics. But I realized, particularly with the mess the world is in at the moment, it's enormously important. So, particularly as you talk about Turkey and China.
Thank you.
I'm Sue Sakira, and I'm actually a former employee of the International Monetary Fund, where I worked for 23 years, but not as an economist. So now I'm really interested in keeping up with what's going on.
Can't hear.
Yeah, we have to speak up because they were competing next.
Oh, right. Okay. So I'm interested in keeping up with what's going on in the world economy now, since I retired a long time ago from the IMF. And I read the Financial Times annually, which I think gives a good picture of global affairs. I'm particularly interested in how climate change might affect the economy. Places like Pakistan, some severe flooding and drought, California, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then, I'm Suzanne Sanders. My daughter has a partner who's an economist, and he seems to focus on entirely different things in the world than I do. And so I thought it would be interesting to look at things from his point of view a little bit before I see him at the holidays, and so we can talk more on the
I think this PowerPoint will help you.
Yeah.
Just don't show it to me. So he'll say, oh, I never thought about the impact of the pandemic on GDP growth.
We miss Clyde.
Sorry, Clyde. How can we do that?
He's hiding.
My name's Clyde McClellan. I think, like the gentleman back here, I didn't really understand how the impact of inflation and how do these same type of thing is like, how do these people survive in environments where things are doubling and tripling, and how do you provide for your families, and does it go underground? What really happens in those scenarios?
I think we could, Clive, I think we could deepen that a little bit more in the next class. You know, barter is one big deal, you know, when you don't have money that works. But foreign currency is another one. So I think that's an interesting one. And I think, Lois, your question about the US dollar fits very well. And I'll say a few words about that too. And you're also in the class.
My name is Bob Gore. Macroeconomics kind of makes my brain hurt, so I'm here to kind of take a little therapy. Since the question about BRICS really came up and what the implications are for that, I think I could pivot to China. I think my question is, what happens in China if the real estate market collapses like we saw in 2008? What happens with their population bomb? Their GDP for a decade or more was 8 or 9%. Now we're looking at that blue bar there that's 4.5 or 5%. And so what happens if China really tanks? What happens to the world economy?
Yeah, it'll be affected.
And I'm in the class too.
You are, please.
I'm Lynn Randall, and I'm primarily interested in the impact of immigration on other countries, because we have so much movement in the world going on right now from areas where the people can no longer grow a crop, and so they're moving.
Okay, so I've noted kind of a cluster of things, and I'll think about that for next time: life and poverty, climate change, inflation, migration. Yes.
We have something in the chat from Michael saying that he would like. What happened to it? Oh, okay. He would also like for you in the next 2 weeks to address what happens with global warming in the coming years.
Yes. So that's I'll put that into climate change, and in fact, you know, this was a pretty big discussion, and we'll get to that in a minute. But you know, one of the things to keep in mind is when you try to address climate change, it competes with many other priorities, and so making room for it, and especially finding government money, is one of the really major concerns. And so, you know, we'll get to that in a minute. Let me just make one observation, Lois, on the dollar. You know, the dollar is a lead currency and has been a lead currency. And sometimes countries say, well, I'm not going to use the dollar anymore, you know, deal with it. That would be a big plus for the US, quite frankly. Because being a reserve currency is very expensive. That's the short answer. And I can explain that further. But, you know, being the reserve currency means that, you know, your financial markets become extremely attractive because it is the safe haven. And when you have problems anywhere in the world, money flows to the US, to the dollar. And what happens is the dollar becomes more expensive, just like, you know, whenever there's demand for a good, it becomes more expensive unless you can produce more, which you cannot. And then a strong dollar, although it gets a lot of kudos in the financial press, if you are in manufacturing, it basically kills you because you are not competitive. And not competitive, not because you don't have the best workers or the best factories or whatever. You're simply not competitive because the price internationally of your currency is going up while others are going down. And so any country, let's say like China, has benefited tremendously from the fact that, you know, they are so cheap. You know, and they're not a lead currency and they're not a reserve currency. So the short answer to your question is I think it will be a plus. But people who say, we will abolish the reserve currency, they're meaning to say that as a threat. But it's not.
I thought a strong dollar and a strong military is what maintained the liberal world order.
Not quite. The military, I can't comment on. Yes, Ken.
So if the dollar was moved to the side, what currency would take over?
Well, that's a good question, and that's why it doesn't get moved to the side, very simply speaking. Of course, you do have others. You have the yen, which is another very important international currency. You have the euro, very important currency. The pound is a very important currency. But many of the commodities are denominated in dollars and trade takes place in dollars. So yeah, I mean, that's the question. If you wanted to discuss with people in South Africa, that's a good question to ask. But as I said, I think it was meant as an aggressive, leave the
It's
dollar.
more prestige than.
But it is more than prestige because of the safe haven that stands behind it. If you have a choice between leaving your money in Russia and bringing it to the US, there's absolutely no question. But even among advanced economies, because you have very deep markets here, financial markets, it's an attractive place to park your money or keep it. Sure.
So I think I did have a question, and I'm so inarticulate, this is gonna be embarrassing, but I understand that in August or September, a new coalition with a new currency was to be launched. It was what, China, Brazil? And I would love to know a little bit more about that and what the anticipated impact of that will be.
Claudia, Dodie said it's hard for her to hear you, so maybe speak up a little bit more.
Okay.
See, that's getting, yeah.
That will be, Dodie, can you hear me now? Can you hear me better? Apparently not. Does it make a difference?
She looks like she's stuck.
Why don't you check in with
okay.
Mike?
Or maybe,
Michael.
maybe not. Yeah, I don't know exactly what that is about, Jody. I can look it up, but lots of things are said sometimes because they sound radical and they sound innovative, but we don't just develop a currency like that. If you have seen what it took to develop the euro, it took basically 50 years. And even now, our former head of the IMF, Mr. Kamdesu, who you will remember well, is writing books about why the euro is not going to last. So, it's not something that you can throw together easily. But it sounds like an interesting, idea. I think there was one more question, Paul, and then, go ahead.
I was going to say, with Russia, for example, you would think that with the lowering of the ruble, they could sell more oil, but they can't sell oil, so it's another whammy.
Well, that's an extreme case, of course, because we're in a war, right?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
What's the impact of cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, cryptocurrencies. We had a whole class on cryptocurrencies. Let's leave that for another time.
Okay.
It's a wonderful topic as well. And all I'll say at this point is that, when cryptocurrencies started to float around, and you see the, signs here and there, the central banks that are in charge of monetary stability in all the countries initially said, well, we're a little skeptical about it. But at this juncture, I think most central banks have come to the realization that some sort of e-currency is going to be needed. Why? Because I think we're all experiencing that cash is useful in some places, but you can find yourself going to a coffee shop that says, sorry, we don't accept cash. And of course, so many things are cashless, anything online, etc. And if you don't have a credit card in the bank account, etc., you're completely shut out of the market, and that has become a problem from the point of view of central bankers. They do realize that the cash dollar is just not enough to satisfy the needs of a good, well-functioning currency.
I do have,
Now, yes.
to follow up on that, I hear some commentaries, I understand it, that these commentators are cautioning people about the coming digital currency. What's all that mean?
Yeah, why don't we get back to that next time? Because I think at this point we don't have very concrete suggestions on the table, but this is something in the making. Dodie, is this any better?
we have to talk, so she.
Okay, can you hear me any better now? Yes, a little bit? Okay, good. So I will try to keep this up. Now to Lynn's question, does everyone use the same method to compile information on GDP? And the answer is, in principle, yes. I myself spent many years visiting countries and working with them on implementing what is called the System of National Accounts. The current version of this manual is 2008. Another one is being prepared, but essentially this is the methodology that is being used. You see a lot of symbols down there. Those are all the international organizations that have signed on to that. If you have never taken a macroeconomic course, don't worry about this equation here. If you have, you might find it useful. But basically, a very, very simple way of thinking about GDP is that it adds up 4 big groups of spending or revenue. One is the consumers, one is business, the investors, one is government, and one is trade, export minus import. Okay, as I said, you can forget this if it's not helpful to you. But my next slide is going to show you the sort of the global outlook on the consumer and investor perspective. Let's see if I can move this. I don't know why this is, okay. So here is consumer.
Anytime I move my cursor back here to answer the chat, I have to remember to put it back.
Okay. So here is a slide that shows you the consumer investor perspective. This is the consumer and business confidence indicators. So that's another part of itself to measure this, but this is pretty well measured. The sources there are IMF staff and Haber Analytics. And I should mention that one of the reasons why the IMF is a very good source is that the IMF spends a lot of its resources visiting each member country every year to do a comprehensive economic analysis. And so there are desks responsible for each country. And so therefore, these kinds of information data clusters represent a very good quality of information. What do we see here? Well, let's start with the euro area. The dotted lines are the consumer perspective, and the solid lines are the producers or the business perspective. So what this tells us, if you look at the top line, the red dotted line, that's European consumers. They're getting a little bit more discouraged. In other words, their confidence is going down. And the assumption is that when people's confidence goes down, they will consume a little less, postpone some consumption, and so they will kind of slow things down on balance. Versus the solid line, the solid red line, that would be investors in Europe, in the euro area. And so they have come crashing down until July 22. And now we have a problem here, and you can't. Yeah. Oh, now you're paraphrasing me. Okay. And then it is going up. So currently, so this is on the upswing. So investors are feeling more confident. They will invest. They will start new productions, expand production, etc. So you'll see kind of 2 different directions there. China is the yellow line, is dove down in the first part of 22, which was when the war broke out when Russia attacked Ukraine. So obviously this had some pretty significant impact. Pessimism all the way. So you can imagine that when the political level, the political party looks at this sort of information, they may think of ways to, up the confidence. Politicians, of course, look at these data very intensively because they know next, if there's elections or even just public opinion, will be influenced by this. And then for the United States, the solid line investors are pretty stable. They're not easily thrown off by big events. And consumers, on the other hand, became quite pessimistic and are still pessimistic, but less so. So that is the dotted blue line, which is, tending up a little bit. So this is an important component of GDP. And we saw earlier the big number, the 3%, and now we're looking at it in a more detailed way. So that was the C and I, and now we'll look at G, which is the government. If I can advance this. Okay, so the G really refers to government spending, but I'm going to cheat a little bit because this is a bit more interesting here. This shows us some information about government debt, which of course, is a huge political issue in this country and in Europe, less so in other countries. The advanced economies, you can see, started before the pandemic at a level of 103. We're measuring debt relative to GDP. That's a very common metric. And the Europeans, when they established the euro, they agreed that debt should be approximately 50% of GDP max. Okay, now you can see that this didn't go so well. But all over the advanced countries started at 102 or so. By the time of the pandemic in 2020, it went way up by more than 20 percentage points, and then it started tapering down a little bit. The shaded area on the right, 23 and 24, are estimates, so that could turn out to be quite different. But the general message is, okay, things are relaxing. Okay, things are definitely improving on the debt front. The United States is at the very bottom, starting at 107, which is very high already. Went up to 133 percent of GDP, so that's extremely high, and is slowly coming down, but very slowly. Yes.
Why are Japan's numbers so high? But it may be perfectly appropriate for that country.
Well, I am not sure why it's appropriate. There's a whole literature on why it's okay, but frankly, I personally have questions.
Who holds Japan's debt?
Yeah, well, let's just look at Germany for 1 minute here, where Germany is obviously a huge outlier. Starting at 61% and, going up a little bit through the pandemic, even down at first and then up a little bit. And that, of course, is perhaps one of the reasons why, on balance, for Germany, it was more expensive to go through the pandemic. We saw in the earlier slide that the euro area experienced, a negative impact of the pandemic. So they were less, generous in supporting consumption and supporting spending, because they are very, I am from Germany, so I know they're super focused on fiscal prudence. But you can also think of that as saying, well, Germany is such a major player. Are they really paying, what it takes to be a global player? And of course, that was one of the messages that President Trump brought to Europe when he was president. So anyway, there's lots of stuff to think about, and other questions like what about Japan's debt, etc. This is a big, interesting topic. On the U.S., I would say one more thing, and that relates to the question of the dollar. U.S. debt is also a very valuable investment document or paper or an asset. So there's great interest in U.S. bonds, as there is in European bonds. So if you ever ask yourself the question, maybe it would be best to just pay off the debt and let it be. Well, that would be a huge financial fiasco globally. And it would, have enormous negative repercussions everywhere because so much, it is part of the safe haven feature that you have interesting and attractive assets to sell, including government bonds, stocks, private and public, other bonds, etc. So it's a big deal in the world financial markets. About Japan, one of the reasons why people say, oh, yes, they have, way over 200% of GDP in debt, it's not such a big deal because it's all held domestically. But that does not really persuade me, because what does that mean? Suppose you say, oh, let's just cancel out some of the debt, it's just, our local pension fund. No, you can't do that. I mean, you may think you can let it out somehow, but it doesn't just let out, because if you bankrupt your pension fund, you have obviously, as we can all appreciate, a major problem. Or your health insurances, if you just tell them, sorry, you can't pay, we'll pay the international guys, but, investors, but we won't pay our domestic. So that's why I personally don't find that argument to be very persuasive. But how can they have such a high level? Well, markets are sometimes pretty tolerant. Italy is another example, very high levels. And of course, it costs more. I mean, interest rates have to be, reflect the risk of this. Okay, so we have now covered the C and the I and the G. To some extent, I have a couple more on the G because it's such an important topic. I just wish I could figure out how to handle this.
Just tell us one.
Okay. Yeah. All right, so here's just one more picture to look at. This shows us for advanced economies, the emerging market, and the low-income countries, what it costs them to pay the interest on their bonds. Okay, and so here is, if you start with the blue line, that's the advanced economies, and they pay about 8.2% of their total government revenues to service the bonds. That's pretty expensive, but so it's almost 10% of your revenues go to pay your debt, if you will, or just service the debt. It's not really paying it down. But if you compare that to the low-income countries, they pay almost 13% of government revenues just to keep their debt afloat. And of course, it makes sense if you think about it, because the risk of issuing, for any of us, if we had to choose between buying a government bond that was issued by, let's say, Germany, or one that was issued by Rwanda, Rwanda would have to offer you a pretty good rate before you are willing to buy that, right? And most countries are in the Rwanda situation. And very few countries, we have 200 countries approximately, very few countries, 25 or so, are in this comfortable position of being able to offer their bonds relatively cheaply. But even here, we see that, there's a dip down and then there's an increase in the price, reflecting what investors think about the total. Is it getting too high relative to the size of the economy? And this one I just think is plain fun, because what it shows us, ultimately, all of your government expenditure, including debt, have to be earned back somehow. And a major source of revenue for any government is, of course, taxes. Not in all countries. When you think of Saudi Arabia, that would be very different because the government itself owns so much of the economy. But if you look again at the low-income countries, their tax collection relative to their economic size, GDP, is the lowest of the three groups. Okay, so it has gone up a little bit from 5% to about, 12%, 13% perhaps. which I think reflects to some extent very intensive work to help countries develop tax collection systems, efficient systems, and to persuade people to pay taxes. Because that is, it's an attitude as well as anything else. And in many countries, all of you who travel will be very aware that the informal sectors can be gigantic. And people just say, why should I pay taxes? I mean, I get nothing back. Schools are lousy, I have electricity outages, water outages, So it has to do with the technical part, but also with just the attitude. And also a lot of rich people in low-income countries don't keep their money in their own countries, don't invest. So Japan is one extreme case, but in most countries it is very different. And don't you love the cheerleading and music? It's
I can't tell if it's down there or over
No,
here.
it's out, it's down there.
It's there, yeah.
We're competing with, I think she's right, the cheerleaders. We don't have as much energy.
Whereas in the advanced economies, it's fairly stable. I don't know exactly what the blip is there, but it's pretty stable and pretty high. So it's about 25%. And we know, of course, that the huge fights between these numbers are not, just there. I mean, we know that there's a lot of political struggle and fights and disagreements and discussions, should taxes be lowered and so on, what kind of taxes, income taxes and sales taxes and whatnot. But at the bottom line, there's an understanding that, you do need to collect taxes, and here is approximately the more part of what it takes to run, an advanced economy. This is a topic, of course, you could go on for a long time, because if you look at individual countries, you can think of many scenarios, and the IMF has a huge department that does nothing but our fiscal affairs department, and they're having, wonderful debates. But at the end of the day, you need to think about, the relationship between what you can afford and, what you can tax to gain the money that you need. Okay, so we have now, yes.
Do you have an explanation for the roughly 50% improvement of the lower income from 2000 to present?
Well, the one
Can you repeat the question, please?
But the question is, if we look at the green line, we do see an increase, we do see a significant improvement, if you will. Question is why? How did that come about? And one thing I can tell you is that there has been very intensive technical cooperation, technical assistance to countries to help them develop their fiscal policy apparatus, if you will, including everything that belongs, starting with creating tax ID numbers, for instance, and then creating systems on, administering taxes, all the way to communication strategies to persuade people to participate in the tax collection. And then, of course, also, to some extent, international enforcement has a little bit of a role. It's not that easy for someone from another country to bring your money to the EU or to the US or to Switzerland. You have to be very wealthy if you want to park your money there. For people who are more in the middle class, it's very difficult to. And that is a result of international cooperation and anti-money laundering policies and things of that sort. So I think that's what you see reflected, but nevertheless, considering that they can at least afford having low tax collection rates, we're still very far away from what is sustainable. And that's, I think, the current reality. Okay, so we have covered, let's see, the next slide, please. Just to refresh your memory, in case you forgot, this will be on the test, of course.
Does any government in the world actually expect to collect enough taxes to cover what they're spending?
Oh, this is just the best question. does any government expect to collect enough taxes to cover the spending? Yeah. So another way of asking that question is, should there ever be deficit spending, or is it conceivable that you live without deficit spending? Yeah. And there are some countries. Some of them are the ones that you would probably least expect it from, but of course there are some countries that are unbelievably wealthy. And you can think of Kuwait as a good example, where everyone gets when they turn 18, everybody gets a house and things like that. There are some other countries like Norway, that are also, because of the oil revenue and because of the excellent and very competent way in which oil revenues are administered in Norway, namely by creating a huge wealth fund for the next future generations. Some other countries have similar approaches, particularly major oil and gas export countries. United Arab Emirates is another example for that. So so there are countries and there are circumstances when countries not only expect to spend less than what they get, and they may not even have a tax system because they may not be necessary. But for the vast majority of us, it's always a struggle, and so the economists look at that as a situation where sometimes you have to do deficit spending just to keep the economy going, and other times you should aim for surpluses. But the reality, as we know, is more complicated than that, because once you get used to deficits, it's kind of hard to move back to a surplus. But yeah, so there are certainly examples of that. We haven't spoken that much about trade, but during the annual meetings in Marrakesh, trade was a pretty important issue, and it is, in fact, was discussed as one of the important drivers of inflation. Those of us, who were around, and all of us were, I think, in the 70s, inflation was high, and there were many different drivers. Wages were one of them, increasing wages, because when you have full employment, wages they go up because people switch jobs more easily, etc. But in the current situation, inflation was attributed very much to commodity prices and trade, particularly in the context of the pandemic, and even more so after the war broke out in Ukraine. Because then, as you know, commodity prices or commodities became a major focus. So let's look at the global, can we have the next slide, please? The global outlook. So again, back to the global outlook overall, suggests that trade is slowly picking up. The agency that is most active there is the World Trade Organization in Geneva, but IMF, World Bank, many others are also very much interested and focused on collecting data and information on trade. So here we come looking at a statistic that is speaking more to the situation due to the Russian invasion in Ukraine than it is to the pandemic, because the pandemic was not so much something that immediately affected trade in commodities. It was more other aspects of trade that were affected by the pandemic. So we have a huge decline in growth in 2022. The expected growth rate is about 3%. For the current year, it's very small, 0.8%, and picking up again in 2024. And the impact of trade is different for different countries. For China, it would be very, very impactful, much less so for the US. But again, for Europe, being very open economies, it makes a huge difference, and of course for Russia as well. Okay, can we have the next slide? So this is a picture of world trade, and it is merchandise trade And there's an important difference between merchandise trade and service trade. The merchandise trades are, all the cell phones and anything physical like that. Commodities are also merchandise. And they can be measured relatively easily because you can look at a container and you know what's in there. You have great documentation of all of that. So it's relatively straightforward to measure merchandise. Services are more difficult to measure, and that's why you find less information about services, although services have become so much more important. So if you think about foreign students coming to the US, which is an important part of the US economy, that's a service that the US exports because people come in and they have to pay with US dollars they bring, just like an export of a commodity. It's just inverse because they come into the countries. So the volume dipped down in 2020. We know why, because this was the pandemic and a lot of ships were stopped wherever they were. A lot of trade just came to a halt. And wasn't this one ship stuck in the Suez Canal? I don't think this is in the city, but that's another thing. We know that everybody was just kind of freezing up, so it's a huge dip down, and then people realized, you can't just stop. We do need some, and then that's when the word supply chains all of a sudden showed up everywhere. Now we're all like experts on supply chains. 5 years ago, nobody talked about this, but and it's a big topic now. So it's been inching up again, and then on the right hand side where you see the different shades, those are different scenarios. So depending on how the world economy develops, trade will either pick up more or pick up less. So there's a spectrum: optimistic case, pessimistic case.
So we have a question in the chat wondering what are the units on the y-axis? Axis.
It's an index. It's a volume index. So it starts 2015 is 100, and it's we're seeing here 2019. So 2015 it was 100, and then we're looking here starting at 110. So it's just an index number, and it's another can of worms. It's again a great question because how do you measure volume of trade? When you have to add up 10,000 cars and 50 million pounds of sugar and a few other things. What's the common? So each has different measures. So one could be a number, one could be kilos or pounds or etc. So to do that, you have to create a statistical indicator, a measure, and so here these are called volume indexes, and then an index can be adjusted to a year. It's a little arbitrary. You could also start in 2020 and then see how things develop from there. It depends really on what your interest is. All right, hope I answered that question. And what comes next? Let me see. Let's have the next slide. So this is a mess. Don't worry about the details here. We won't go into the details. But again, it's a very colorful, nicely done slide. It's a proxy, if you will, for trade and services. I just mentioned that's more difficult to measure, but tourism is relatively easy to measure. And so you often find data on tourism. Why? Because people go on a cruise, right? And it's all well documented, or you travel to the Caribbean, you can measure the number of people in the plane, etc. And so it's fairly straightforward. Hotel business is also easy to document, relatively speaking. So what you see there is what you would expect. The pandemic, of course, led to a huge plunge. All of a sudden, nobody was traveling. And this also, I think, shows us intuitively what this could mean for different countries. So for the US, for instance, of course, tourism is important. But compare it to, many small island economies in the world where that's pretty much what's going on in terms of the economy. So from one day to the next, no tourists arrive. You can imagine that that's a complete disaster. And very difficult to manage, because if you have a big internal market, you can tell everybody, okay, we'll be cleaning the rooms every day and so on, and remember how that slowly happened, and so confidence comes back, and you don't have anyone, restricting travel, because if you decide to drive to Arizona, you can even camp there if you're, adventuresome. So, working with different options in a large, well-to-do economy is much easier than if you are in Jamaica, where you are dependent on people coming by plane pretty much, or by ship. So all of this is inching up again. Let's not worry about the details, but the big message is that things are improving on that front, and so services being really important for many small countries. This is a very important positive signal.
It plunged to near zero?
Yes.
That's fantastic. Wow.
Well, we saw
I
all
can't
the
imagine
planes
that.
stopped, right? I mean, all the airports were pretty much closed.
Once they
And
sent us all home from school.
Yeah.
March 13th,
right,
2020.
right. But we were back on Zoom pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah.
But we were not traveling to Jamaica or traveling to even further we were not traveling to Rio de Janeiro. Those things were all canceled for a long time, and it was, took a long time for that to recover. Yeah.
So it's fascinating. I'm trying not to give enough more details.
Okay, you can pick one or two.
What color, I can't tell, when we resume, was that Latin America that did the spike up straight? I mean, they're the high number, down.
Yes, Latin America and the Caribbean.
And that would include the Caribbean, so that was probably why.
Yeah.
And so that one is Asia that's lagging behind everybody else.
Yes. I mean, travel, and that could be more than just pandemic, because travel to Asia is a different market, especially China. That may have different reasons than just the pandemic.
Why did we drop that back down again? It looks like early 23 maybe, or late 22.
I'm not sure exactly. I mean, there's so much going on there. I wouldn't overinterpret it, but
Shootings.
What?
Shootings. Because of so many shootings, mass shootings. People don't want to come if there are mass shootings.
But no, this
this is in Asia, and several countries are slowing down.
There was a blip in COVID here.
But it could
I
also
think
be
that's what it was, because things started.
another COVID-related issue. Okay, so we have covered. Remember, we started out with a slight downhill slide of GDP growth from 3.5 to 3 and going a little bit down, but overall a soft landing. And we've looked at the components, we've looked at the consumer and investor behavior or expectations, which are muted but not a disaster by any means. We've looked at government spending and looked at debt, and no one is in the mood of doing anything radical. You can see this is slowly falling, but not anything rapid. And then we looked at trade recovering somewhat. So we're not sliding into the abyss. We are kind of moving along. That is, I think, the basic message of the current situation. Okay, let's see what we have next. Shall we move to the next slide? Okay. So the pandemic obviously was, a major event, and the conclusion is the world did pretty well. And I cannot overemphasize that, because this could have been a disaster, and quite frankly, many of the lessons that were learned by everyone, economists, politicians, from the Great Depression, were applied in a very proactive way. Namely that if you have a huge disaster, you don't start saving money, you start spending money. And the US was one of the most proactive in that and did well. So now, fixing these issues is something else. Then came Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the reaction to that, where everyone's started boycotting or trying to boycott Russia, became a major effect in commodity markets. And the question that people are asking on the international level is this going to push us into a different direction where geopolitical tensions are going to be there to stay because maybe two camps develop? And so on the one hand, we sort of support Russia camp, on the other, US, Europe, and all of the allies there. So that's a big concern at the moment, because commodities are always very political, because they're very important for, they're very concentrated. They are, and I have a slide that shows you on the concentration, which is, I think, quite interesting. Commodities also includes food, which is an explosive issue in many, especially poorer countries. So if food prices go up dramatically, for instance, because wheat is not being transported or being held up as it has been by Russia, that is in terms of global peace a really major factor, and sometimes used as a weapon. So a very dangerous development, and also one that directly links back to the topic of migration. Because when people starve, they get pretty desperate for, and they do desperate things, which, is understandable. Even more so than if, you run out of oil, which is also a problem, but, it's in a way less existential. Critical role for technology. We all know that certain commodities are really important. And it is of such scale that it is affecting economic activity and also what is termed the energy transition. So the IMF and World Bank take that very seriously, so does the WTO. It's become a very major topic of research and topic of political discourse. Let's go to the next slide. This, I think, let's start on the right-hand side. So this is the Ukraine war related to commodity price hikes. On the right-hand side, you see price developments on the yellow line there in Europe. Okay, go way up. Compare that to the US, which is the blue line. And what does it reflect? Well, the Europeans did not have ways to store gas. So for them to substitute Russian gas imports is very difficult. They were kind of caught off guard. I think the US was in many ways better prepared strategically for such a development. And this is another reason, if you think back to the slide where we looked at the cost of the pandemic and how the US, did very well and the euro area did not. Well, this was a major factor. All of a sudden, when you, were in Europe in those days, people were very worried that they would have to turn down their thermostats and be cold, because they knew that prices would not be coming down anytime soon, because rebuilding or building an infrastructure that allows you to store liquid gas is a multi-year project. You can't do that on the fly. So things have relaxed since then. Japan prices went up too, but the most extreme were in Europe. On the left-hand side, you just see different commodities. You see fertilizers went way up. This is, of course, particularly, again, a problem that affects poorer countries. for their agricultural production, but it also affects agricultural production generally. And then various other crude oil, energy, grains, etc. So the war had a real impact on the commodity front. And depending on where you are, if you're an oil exporter, of course, that's not a big problem. On the contrary, it's a windfall gain. But most countries are oil importers and gas importers and energy importers. So then it questions the economic recovery accordingly. All right. Any questions? How are our Zoom folks doing? They've all disappeared. I only see the names.
And Dodie.
Dodie is there.
Well, somebody had to leave.
Dodie, any questions? It's all crystal clear? Okay.
Thank you.
He said he had to leave.
All right. Let's go to the next slide. Yes, so the Director General of the World Trade Organization, which you may not be aware of, is Ms. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. She is the former finance minister of Nigeria and a very outspoken, proactive person. So I thought I might introduce her to you if you hadn't met her already. And the World Trade Organization has a report that the World Trade Report that was also recently published. All of these reports, next time there's annual meetings, you'll see that the Washington Post reports on it, but it's on page 25 somewhere in the back. But you'll recognize the World Economic Outlook and the various world trade, the fiscal monitor, all of these things suddenly appear and create a lot of discussion and a lot of focus on what the current issues and challenges are. So the World Trade Organization stepped out there, and they don't usually do this, but they did this time and said a looming threat is deglobalization and fragmentation of trade. So fragmentation along the political spectrum that we just talked about, created by the war in Ukraine. Also suggesting that decoupling of the world economy into two rival blocs. So of course the assumption is China, Russia, Brazil and other countries will be in one bloc, and US, Europe, Australia, etc. will be, Canada will be in the other bloc, would lower long-run global GDP by over 5%, because trade would have to be, reorganized completely. So it's a warning shot. When you look at the details of the analysis, we're not really deglobalizing. It's not happening. Fragmentation is also pretty limited. But I think what they are saying is that, yes, these things don't happen overnight because, you have established trade routes and so on, and it's a long process to reorient it. We're certainly seeing that with Russian gas and oil exports. And so the conclusion is reglobalization supports security, inclusiveness, and environmental sustainability. So, a very strong argument in favor of continuing to bring the world together, to work together, and to resist the trends where they are to fragment and deglobalize. We'll go on to the next slide. And here's one that, in the entire report, if you look at it, it deals with the question of, is it happening? Is there deglobalization happening, yes or no? And here is a nice chart, and I don't know if you find these charts too crowded, but you don't have to look at every line either. Let me just point out a couple. So if you look at the bars, they add up agriculture, energy, and minerals. And there you see that there's a decline overall. There's a peak in 2009, and and then there's pretty much, with the exception of one blip, there's a downward trend. What we are measuring here is something called foreign direct investment and cross-border mergers. So this reflects, for example, when VW, which comes from my hometown, so I will use it as an example, from Hanover, decides to produce in Chattanooga, Tennessee. That is called foreign direct investment. It's because what it means is that cars will be produced abroad. BMW, not from my hometown, so I don't care where they go, but they're also here, right? And that's foreign direct investment as opposed to portfolio investment. So if you buy shares of VW in Germany or here, that's not direct investment, that's called portfolio investment. But direct investment is a good measure of globalization, because once you set up a plant in Chattanooga, you can't just leave. You can sell your shares in 1 minute, but if you produce in another country, produce in China, it takes a lot to set up a plant and produce in a different country. So it's a pretty good measure of globalization. It's a pretty deep measure. Okay, so foreign direct investment for agriculture, energy, and minerals is kind of going down, but all we're measuring here is the numbers. So if VW comes to Chattanooga, that counts as one, even though they're creating hundreds of jobs. A very small shop could move to another country, would also count as one, even if they just have one employee. So it's a pretty rough measure here. If we look at the black line, that gives us foreign direct investment in all sectors. So that includes manufacturing, that also includes services. So for example, maybe you're an attorney and you're focused on immigration, you could be setting up shop in Dubai. That would be an example of that. And if all of the sectors are not really going down, there's a little blip there, but essentially it's pretty flat. So the conclusion, the answer to my question, is globalization reversing itself based on this? The answer is no. And everybody got the right answer. Perfect.
So the downturn clearly is COVID, and then the slow uptick is just probably reflects the amount of time it takes to locate somewhere else. You don't do that, like you said, buy stock, that's a minute, but if you're going to put a plant somewhere, it takes a little bit more than a couple of weeks to pull that together.
And there could be delays too, because you make a plan to start a plant in a different country, then pandemic hits, you're not going to shelf the plan, but you may postpone it by a year or two. So, yes.
Globalization, re-globalization, was said to benefit security and some others. Do the low-income countries benefit as much when the majority of the growth is all sectors, meaning service included?
You'll have to repeat that.
Yeah, so the question I think is how does foreign direct investment, globally defined, including services, affect countries, poorer countries? Is it the same effect as on richer countries? And I think that the short answer is yes. It is more beneficial for low-income countries because the impact is so much bigger. You can think of, go back to my VWs in Chattanooga. It's great, but honestly, it's not like we wouldn't be driving cars here if they had decided to go to Mexico instead, where they are also producing. But if you think of a poorer country, most poorer countries are also small. I mean, some not, but most. Foreign direct investment, setting up a school or something like that, setting up manufacturing, not necessarily very complex manufacturing, but for instance, clothing, the textiles, those kinds of things have huge impacts in terms of employment and therefore to the economy.
Yeah.
Yes, we're almost done. So when you look at the report, more generally, the World Trade Report, you will see that the conclusion is, okay, it's the political leadership is making it a very big issue, the fragmentation, but the data don't quite show it yet. One more slide, and let's start with this slide, shows us the concentration of commodities. And this is, why commodity trade is a big issue in foreign policy, and international policy generally is not just an economic issue. So what this slide shows us is the market share of the 3 largest providers. I was quite surprised by this myself. So let's start with crude oil, which is kind of in the middle. There, the concentration is not so high as you would expect, right? It's the 3 largest have about 40% of the market share. And that's because oil is produced in many countries. So I don't know exactly who these 3 countries are, but Kuwait is probably one of them. So 3 countries, but there are many others. So if you're thinking about dependency on oil, this is not very high compared to lithium, which is of huge strategic importance. It's important for technology, it's important for energy, it's important for our environmental move away from primary commodities towards, reusable energy, etc. So there we have 3 countries producing 90% of the commodities. Same with cobalt. I'm pretty sure Russia is one of the producers there. Same with nickel. Copper is a whole lot less again. But if we go to the top of the chart, we see agriculture is also very concentrated.
That doesn't make sense. But you know the 3 top countries for agriculture?
I'm not sure what they are, no. You can look it up.
Have almost 80%.
3 countries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, these numbers are very difficult to kind of comprehend for if you're in a very large, highly diversified economy. I mean, and you don't need to import food. Yes, in the US. Europe already is more of a food importer, but also a big exporter of food. But many countries are mainly food importers. So for them, it's very important to know, does the soya beans come from the US? The US is a major producer of soybeans, so then it's important to know, is this a reliable partner? Is there going to be conflict? And then if there is conflict, what's the impact? And I think with Ukraine, you've seen it. Ukraine is a big producer of wheat. So this is a very useful piece of information to have in the back of your mind. And it's very unique to commodities. You think of other factors, for instance, the automobile industry is much more diversified, and many of the automobiles that are produced don't even appear on the world market. We are always focused on automobiles that are traded, but India has many other vehicles that are being produced that are not on that world market. So I do have one last slide. But we could also leave that for next time. Let me close here by thanking you for the undivided attention despite the distractions, or maybe because of the enriching distractions from behind us. We are in the Chesapeake Forum very much committed to working across all ages. I don't
Get them
know
up
who's,
here.
I don't know who's there, but my guess is that, there are
It's a church youth group down there.
lots of different ages, including many younger folks, and obviously having a good time with music. And thank you for your attention. Thank you also for your questions. In our next class, then we will take perhaps 3 or 4 topics along the lines of what you have suggested, and then go a little bit more in depth, and hopefully will be enriching and entertaining. And I wish you a very nice evening.